Call the roll.
Representative Burkhart,
Here.
Vice Chairwoman Duncan,
Here.
Representative Ayer,
Here.
Representative Gray,
Here.
Representative Heiner,
Here.
Representative Sherwood,
Here.
Representative Western,
Here.
Chairman Greer.
Here. Thank you, Barb. Okay, folks, we are back to continue taking testimony on Senate File 84. The sponsor of the bill is here. So we'll just continue with those folks that wish to continue to speak, have comments on this. Anyone? We'll get you next, Richard. You guys shifted seats from Wednesday,
But the middle's full. Phil.
but now we have people in the middle. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Members, Pete Obermuller, Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Thanks so much for taking this up. Mr. Chairman, I want to first thank Senator Boner and the Select Federal Natural Resource Committee for taking up this issue. It's an important issue and there's an important discussion to be had about it. And as you might imagine, I have some thoughts, Mr. Chairman. So with your indulgence, I just want to make a few points, partly in reaction to discussion about this a couple of days ago, and then a couple other things. First of all, I just wanted to have a quick discussion about federal mineral royalties and the concept of a fair return, which we heard about a couple of days ago. Mr. Chairman, federal mineral royalties by itself is a significant source of revenue, both for the federal government and for the state. Over the past 5 years alone, mineral royalties in the state of Wyoming, both my members and Mr. Deti's contributed $3.63 billion to federal and state coffers over the last 5 years. Mr. Chairman, I think you would agree with me that that is probably a fair return to the taxpayers. And I think it's important to understand that when some people talk about a fair return, what they're saying is that it's not fair unless it's high enough that it stops the activity. So I want to say that at the outset, because then it's important to recognize when you start to bring into the discussion our state and local tax rate, which was also discussed. Mr. Chairman, I think you mentioned that we put together our own study on it. We haven't put together our own study on it. We rely on outside sources to do that. And one of those, Mr. Chairman, is a study out of Colorado. They were looking at their tax rates, their effective tax rates in that state relative to other oil and gas producing states. Mr. Chairman, they found that Wyoming is has the highest effective tax rate of oil and gas states, and by a lot. More than double Colorado's, almost triple New Mexico's. And what's interesting about that, Mr. Chairman, is that what they were looking at does not include royalties. This is just the state and local taxes. And so they have a line for property, a line for sales and use, a line for severance, a line for income tax. Wyoming's is the only column number is the only one in that column with a 0 on income tax. Every other state has that, and yet we still have the highest effective tax rate. So the debate, Mr. Chairman, the other day seemed to be about arguments people weren't making about how somehow a reduction in this bill would be an incentive to bring more rigs. That's not the point. The point is, I think, my impression is that the majority of this committee would not raise any of those taxes on the state and local side to drive us further up. But now here we are in a position where the federal government, they're here to help, is likely to raise theirs. And yeah, that'll increase revenue for the state too. But what the committee offered for your consideration is that Wyoming would say, enough is enough. Will allow for this tiny refund, 75% of only the delta, in order to not to offer a tax relief. Tax relief, Mr. Chairman, would be looking at our highest tax rate in the nation and actually offering relief. This is a slowing the rate of increase. That's what he's saying. Is Wyoming standing up for the industry in that case and saying that enough is enough. Mr. Chairman, finally, I want to mention we loves the discussion about rates and whether rates matter and all of that. And again, I think all of you know there's not monocausal reasons for anything. Taxes are part of the discussion. Royalties are part of the discussion. And if we had a choice, if most of my members, if they had a choice, would run, not walk to state and private lands, even with the higher rate, because on a regulatory standpoint, it's so much easier to deal with. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned yourself, and you're right, it's nearly impossible to drill a well in Wyoming and not hit federal minerals. So lucky us, we get the worst of both worlds. We get the higher rates on state and fee minerals with the added regulatory burden of federal lands in pretty much all cases. It simply makes us non-competitive. Now, I'm not going to argue that this bill would incentivize more rigs. That's not what the point of this bill is. We had bills like that. I would simply want to argue, Mr. Chairman, that I've only been in this job for 3 years. And in that 3 years, the price of oil has ranged from negative $37 to $112 today. We simply don't know. We don't know what it's going to look like. And to argue that, well, yeah, it's $112, and so why would you even talk about this? I think it's a broader discussion than that. We're the highest effective tax rate among oil and gas states when we're at $110 and when we're at negative $37. That's the policy we've chosen. And so Senator Boner deserves a little bit of grace, I think, given that fluctuation for a bill he started many, many months ago and years ago at a different price range, just like last year's bill when we tried to do that. And you simply can't know that. So the discussion is just a little bit broader, I think, than just whether or not this delta means anything or whether a fee versus all that kind of stuff. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your time. Thank you for letting me rant. Happy to take questions. And
Mr. Overmule, you weren't ranting, and I'd say the committee wasn't necessarily debating. The committee was trying to discuss. I think everyone can agree that maybe not, but I sincerely believe our tax policy in Wyoming is awful. And the question is how do we find, how do we build and develop the information to have a tax policy that, as we talk, is broad, sustainable, and moves away from the difference between a negative differential on oil, one of our reliance, all the way up to, a premium of 112. It's a big question. I think the members of this committee understand that and are very concerned about how do we make good policy. So I appreciate your comments. Committee, any questions for Mr. Overmuller? Yeah, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Overmuller, could you repeat what state it was that had 1/3 of the Wyoming tax rate for oil and gas?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, I'll in fact send you the report so you can just have it handy. I've sent it to the committee before, but it's probably been a while. The two I mentioned is Colorado is their effective tax rate is a little less than half, and New Mexico's is a little more than 2/3.
Just on that, because it is a worthy discussion, Mr. Overmuller, with New Mexico, we see a stronger mix of federal oil minerals in New Mexico, where Colorado, not so much the case. Is that fair?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's probably fair. And again, that study isn't looking at royalties, just layer royalties on top of that. And then states like other states in the state and local, Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, Kansas, some of the other states in there with very few federal lands, you layer royalties on top of that, it'll switch that ranking. New Mexico would certainly climb. Colorado would climb.
Mm-hmm.
We would climb. We wouldn't get overtaken.
Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermueller, appreciate you being here and the vast knowledge you have of the industry is beneficial for the committee as a group here. You mentioned that it's more difficult because of regulations to drill on federal minerals. And I recognize that fact. There is an overreach of power that the federal administration has exerted upon their minerals, and it has hampered our industry. And that's the lifeblood right now of Wyoming, the extraction industry. So most companies I know have what they call are shelf permits. They try to keep these APDs out in front so they can keep the drill rigs ready. And right now with the moratorium on leasing from the federal administration, how long can this last before it actually starts hampering Wyoming? And is there anything we can do to help expedite some of those regulations that create such a burden on your industry?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heyer, thank you so much for the question. Appreciate your thoughtfulness on the committee. Yeah, it's a tricky one, particularly when, so as you know, 5 consecutive quarters now without a lease sale. There is a significant number of leased but non-producing acres in Wyoming. I hesitate to classify it as shelf, but I see what you're saying. Basically, what happens even in decent times is when operators put together a drilling program and need to be able to design future exploration and production in order to move from their current rig, move their rig from current production to new production. So what I've said all along since the lease moratorium first went into effect and yet to today, the immediate impact on the state of Wyoming is just the lease sale, about $47 million in lost revenue to the state of Wyoming just on that alone. In terms of drilling, it's more of a slow burn. You start to choke off exploration at the top, both with getting rid of non-competitive leasing, so-called non-competitive leasing, and then also with the lease moratorium. Eventually we get to the point where there's nowhere else to look. I can't tell you what that date is. It's going to be more tricky for the smaller, the 80% of oil and gas developers in Wyoming are small businesses, and it'll be harder for them because they don't have the ability to put together those sorts of drilling programs. It'll be different for every company, but eventually it will come home to roost.
Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermueller, could you send that report to the rest of the committee also? I remember looking at it, but I could not right now put my finger on where I have it. So thank you.
Happy to do that.
Also, I think, Pierre, if you would look, Mr. Fuller could help you. But we did have the report 2 years ago where the legislature commissioned a comparison. And there is a good discussion on the changes of tax rates, just for a second look at it. It's similar results in that report as well.
Mr. Chairman, I can send them both at the same time. I have them both. And the one that you all commissioned has its challenges. It's an interesting report, but it does layer royalties on top and has some interesting discussion in there.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Let me, the committee's done a couple questions on timing with this. I assume, you have a brother and sisterhood of like organizations around the country with presence in Washington, DC. What is your understanding of the status of the increase in the mineral royalties, and just what is your knowledge of, I guess, the overall status?
Mr. Chairman, appreciate the question. It might surprise you to know that this current Department of Interior doesn't call me very often. So I honestly don't know what the status is. I know what you know with respect to what the rhetoric has been. You'll recall that the entire purpose of the lease moratorium was so that they could carefully study the so-called broken leasing system, and then the report analyzing all that came out the day after Thanksgiving, where nobody was paying attention, and it was all a laundry list of things that they've said are wrong with the leasing program that's been on their list for years and years and years. So nothing really new. in there. One of them is the argument about raising royalty rates. And then the senator mentioned the accidentally leaked quarter one lease that had it going up to 18.75 and then reduced. So I don't have inside knowledge on it and don't expect to.
On that, so again, just kind of pushing you on that particular issue, what is pending? I mean, does this require federal legislation, or is this something that can be done by rule with the Department of Interior?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, in contrast to holding leases, which actually is the law, on the raising the royalty rate, it's up to or a minimum of, a minimum of 12.5. So the department could raise it really at any time.
Okay. Committee, any further questions? Mr. Obermueller, thank you.
Thank you for your time, members. Appreciate it.
Mr. Garrett, you had your hand up.
Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Richard Garrett. Today I'm here representing the Wilderness Society. Let me describe their mission for you very briefly. It is to unite people to protect America's wild places, and their vision is a future where people and wild nature flourish together, meeting the challenges of a rapidly changing planet. And I think that describes our world right now very accurately, a rapidly changing and very volatile planet. I really appreciate the bringer of the bill and the committee's work on this bill, both the FNRM committee and your committee, Mr. Chairman. I also appreciate the passion and understanding and knowledge of folks that have already commented to this committee, and in particular, Mr. Obermueller's comments, really extraordinary, I think. I endorse a broader conversation. We endorse a broader conversation about Wyoming's tax structure as you do, Mr. Chairman. Personally, and now I am speaking personally, I would very much welcome an opportunity to have a conversation about paying my fair share and not being such a burden to the state and to our mineral producers. So a broader conversation certainly needs to be had. I don't think anybody on this committee disagrees with that. And I suspect the minerals industry agrees as well. I know that my friend Julia Stubel, who serves as the organizations that is the Wilderness Society's Public Lands and Energy Manager, has been in touch with you, and I've shared some of her comments in writing with you through the LSO. There's no doubt what minerals means to the state of Wyoming and has historically meant. If you go out of this room and up that little flight of stairs and look to your right and to your left, you'll notice two, I call them alcove offices. Those are coal chutes back in the day. And can you imagine how much coal was needed to heat this building and how much natural gas is needed to heat this building now? So we all benefit from that.
Well, Mr. Garrett, I think when we're in session, it requires a lot less.
Well,
A lot of hot air.
and with that, I'll conclude.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm going to be brief. I do have one concern that I'd like to bring to the attention of the committee, and I might be misreading this, and my apologies if I am, but I'd draw your attention to page 4, lines 1 to 3, and page 5, lines 16 through 18. They read that the refund shall not exceed the total annual severance tax liability for the taxpayer. As Mr. Obermueller described, he doesn't have a pipeline to Interior. I guarantee you I don't either. But it's probably fair to say that Interior is paying attention, that the administration is paying attention to what happens in Wyoming, because we are one of the nation's largest energy producers. There was a time when we produced 1 out of 6, 1 out of 8 BTUs consumed by this nation. My concern with the wording of that line is that they will see that we are going to refund, some amount of the federal mineral royalty if it's increased, and they'll say, well, hey, we're going to raise it just all the more till we hit that floor that Wyoming has said we're not going to go beyond. Now, I might be reading that sentence wrong, and I would encourage your careful inspection of it and correct me if I'm wrong, and I apologize if I am.
Well, Mr. Garrett.
Yes, sir.
I think it's a good point to explore is, political motivations of things. But I look at the extractive industry as a way to provide jobs within our state, and it's been a revenue source for us that we've done wonderful things with. But if the goal is to somehow rectify what is perceived to be an unfair royalty, that's one thing. If the goal is to stop production, it's completely a different thing. Would you agree? And I assume that's where your comments come from.
Well, I don't disagree with that, Mr. Chairman, although I would not necessarily want to put words in others' mouths. That is not the goal of the Wilderness Society, though. Mr. Obermuller spoke to that issue. Our Wyoming coal is going to be around for a very long time, and within different contexts, the organization and others too certainly support carbon capture, sequestration done correctly. It's all a matter of how it's done and how it's done correctly. I think that there is a scenario under which Wyoming's coal can continue to be produced, Wyoming's natural gas and oil can continue to be produced, and to the benefit not only of our state, but also to our environment. That's the reality, Mr. Chairman. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. I wasn't directing it specifically at you or your organization. I was a more broader question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in any event, in the interest of brevity, I think that I've said about all I need to say, and I'd appreciate your comments or questions. If not, I'll look forward to your continued conversation on this important issue.
Any questions, committee?
Okay.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you, Mr.
Anyone
Chairman.
else wishes to testify on this? Please come forward. I think make sure your mic is on there. Mr.
That on? Yeah,
There you go.
thank you. My name is John Burrows, and I'm here representing the Wyoming Outdoor Council. We think that this bill is not a good policy direction for the state, and we urge you to vote against it for several reasons. First, this bill seems very premature to us. At this time, it's not clear if or how the federal government will raise royalty rates, especially given the evolving situation in Europe and a strong bipartisan push to secure domestic energy supply now. It feels too early to enact policy that sets the stage to refund millions of dollars of potential state revenue back to private interests to offset increased royalties they may not ever have to pay. It seems wiser to wait and see if these federal policies actually come to fruition, do our due diligence to study their actual impacts, and avoid rushing headlong into selling our state budget short before we're sure the federal government is going to do this. This is especially true when you think about the cost of implementing this new program, which, as we heard last Wednesday, would be on the order of about $145,000 in administrative cost. Second, we're concerned that passing this bill will only increase the uncertainty of Wyoming's financial outlook in the long run. We know this bill has been talked about in terms of providing stability for producers, but we're skeptical that this policy would help our state achieve a more certain and stable future for the public in the long run. As you all are keenly aware, Wyoming has seen many boom and bust cycles over the years. This is something all of us are working hard to mitigate and change. Right now, and as we just heard in testimony, we see energy prices at some of the highest rates in decades, with crude oil up over $100 a barrel. And this is up from 2 years ago, where we've seen it at its lowest. We think it's hard enough for the public to feel stability in our state budget around these boom and bust cycles without committing to refund severance taxes back to private producers in a volatile global market. To be clear, it seems as if under this policy, the booms may be very good, but the bust will be all the more painful below the refund thresholds when prices drop below those refund thresholds that are in the bill. Assuming the federal government does move forward with raising royalty rates in the future, we think the state could surely use those dollars to support and invest other critical programs like education and ways to help diversify our economy. Finally, we're concerned that we're discussing an effort to incentivize production through manipulating the state's tax structure. As you know, and as has been referenced, the legislature has invested in studies to examine the forces that affect production. And these largely conclude that production is affected more by market forces and geology than tax policy. So with that said, we don't believe that Wyoming has much to gain from this policy, especially by acting prematurely to counter federal royalty increases that may or may not come. We urge you to vote no on this bill and really appreciate your time in the discussion. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Burrows? I do have just a minor comment, a little pushback. 145,000 on administrative costs on $650 million a year is a rounding error. And I'm just a big believer that when we put a burden on our agencies, we make sure we deal with that. So I think that's quite a big an issue, is the higher policy issues. Just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishes to testify? Okay. No one else? We'll close public testimony. Okay. What's the committee's pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to table this bill. What I heard from testimony.
Hold on. It's a non-debatable
Thank you.
issue. Is there a second? Seconded by Heiner. Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, raise the hands. All those in favor, raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So committee will table that bill by that vote. Now go ahead. I'll give you the courtesy of the reason why you tabled it. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just based on testimony that we heard earlier this week and today, there's, at least for me, still a lot of unknowns. I think there's a lot of assumptions in the bill. My biggest concern is actually that this came out of the Senate without an appropriation. So I don't know that we've really addressed how our agency will support this. And yeah, there are just broader conversations to have about the administrative impact and really our tax policy in general. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. And I think Senator Boner, we'll put this on our list for an interim topic where it's teed up with a more thoughtful. I'm not being critical. I didn't mean to say that way, but we're just a little broader. I don't want to say public input on a particular issue. We've got time to look at this. Especially with leases that are in place, I think, for the various extractive industries. I also would like to see our committee between now and the interim read the 2 reports that Mr. Overmuller is going to follow through us. We have done tax policy matters. Now, these are royalties, but so it's not necessarily tax, but it has the same implications with that. Okay. Well, committee, I don't have any other bills assigned to us, meaning that Monday morning you can sleep in if you so desire. Anyway, so with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.